Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the AI Healthcare Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Reed, and today we are joined with my friend, Jon Warner, who's the Executive Chairman of Citizen Health, Advisory Board Chair of Multiply AI, and he's also an advisor at Healthonomy. Jon, thank you so much for your time today.
Of course, it's great to be here.
We're glad you're here. And just to start off the conversation, how did you get into AI healthcare?
So, without turning this into a long story, I've been in healthcare now for more than 25 years, and all of that has pretty much been in innovation and technology. So, I started a long way back, and if you do that calculation, that's back to the late 90s when we were pre-internet, we were pre-EMRs, we were pre-mobile devices. But of course, we were using AI back in the day. It was very simple AI. Artificial intelligence doesn't mean what it meant today. So I've been involved since the beginning. What's changed is that AI has come more and more to the fore. In the last 18 months, it's almost the only thing we're talking about. But I feel that all technology these days is somewhat AI driven. So it's impossible to ignore. So I'm involved with it extensively now.
Yeah, way before my time. Don't mean to age myself too much, or
No, no,
you
no.
either.
But the history is important, right? I mean, people use words like technology. You can tie a handle to a rock, and that's technology, right? You give the rock some ability to go and as a tool. That's technology. But I think we're in a brand new world now, and it's a very exciting world. But it's good to know the history of where these things came from.
Yeah, definitely. And that actually goes into my next question nicely. So what is the story? You're involved with multiple organizations, Citizen Health, Multiply AI, and then Healthonomy. Like, what are the stories with each of those organizations, and how are they similar and different when they kind of in your day-to-day life in the AI healthcare space?
Yeah. So just for context, let me say I spent all my time doing advisory work for what are basically venture and institutionally backed companies trying to be disruptive in health and healthcare. The three you've mentioned are the ones that make the greatest use of AI in terms of what they do. They're all different. They don't compete with one another directly. And we'll talk about that just in a second. But let me give you just a very short pen portrait of all three. And I'll work backwards from the ones you said. Healthonomy is a business that is helping individuals to leverage the incredible number of tools that are now available. I guess we might call them chatbots that we can interrogate for generative AI in particular. Pick the right tool, load up the right documents we might want to include other than searching on the general internet, for example, crafting our prompt engineering in intelligent ways and giving people therefore answers that are useful and can be deployed in very specific use cases in healthcare. For the most part, they do that in the post-acute space in healthcare, and we can talk about the details of what they do. But it's a way of reducing the confusion. I read the other day there are well over now 200 commercially available chatbots. So it's not just ChatGPT anymore. There's all these other ones that we've been playing with. They help reduce that confusion. Multiply is a company specifically focused on cardiac disease and then using a particular approach in terms of research that's been through clinical trials. In this case, it's atherosclerosis, which is really the calcium buildup in the blood. What's AI driven about that is they're taking the patterns of the data in terms of the blood draw and using AI to analyze those patterns and the results. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of data points that only AI and supercomputing can deal with now. And what that's doing is creating a predictive biomarker. So we're now able to much more accurately predict whether someone is sailing into cardiac problems, even at a younger age. So you could be full of atherosclerosis, you can have very little of it, despite the fact you might have other comorbidities. So that's what Multiply spends their time doing. Citizen Health is different in as much as it's a boutique consulting company at a minor level, but it's a product company in the other. And what it's doing is using a whole ton of AI in the mix to help build product in the care gaps. So in that case, it would be in provider space or the payer space, for example. And it's saying, let's find the care gaps and then let's use every bit of AI that's out there that's useful, perhaps as an agent, to do a task that we're not doing very well today. And there are many examples of that I can talk of as well, just in terms of where those care gaps exist. So that's really what Citizen does. And it's getting more and more exciting because I think the tools we have available to us are getting more and more sophisticated and more easy to use. So we're going to see a lot more deployment of AI, but that's the quick summary.
Yeah, and it's just amazing to me. Just when I just remember being a little kid, going into the doctor's office, for example, and used to have to like fill out all those forms. And I mean, mind you, that was post 1996, with HIPAA. So it's like, you bring up interesting points. It seems like we're kind of at this, what like seesaw. Like that's kind of really why I interpret it's like in healthcare we do all this innovation, and then it's like the non-innovative portion kind of brings it back to reality. So it seems like we're always at this in this constant battle.
We are in a constant battle. And I think you raise a really good point. I think technology often goes faster than we're capable of handling it. So I happened to be in the doctor's office, my annual checkup yesterday. And I said two things. I said, number one, I'm wearing an Aura ring on my finger. I've got 4 sensors in this. It gives me very sophisticated data on my iPhone. A lot of that is AI interpreted just in terms of the patterns that are in it, which allows me to go and deal with issues that I struggle with all my life. Sleep being a good example. I'm a very poor sleeper. The doctor was not the slightest bit interested because they've never been trained on any of this. He's got no capacity to take the data. He can't put it in the EMR system. So therefore, we couldn't have an intelligent conversation. So what you know is that the technology sometimes is well ahead of our capacity to take it. Incidentally, I also filled out the usual paperwork I would have filled out in the late 90s. Which is crazy, with a pen, with a funny little thing on the end of it, right? Sitting in the waiting room doing that. And I thought, wow, I know ambient listening is around now. AI is driving that. I could have had all of this because I've filled out really easily. And I seem to do it again and again. So we've almost got to kind of bridge those two worlds in the future, in my opinion.
And that's kind of one of the things that I've always thought the reason why kind of healthcare has been very slow to adapt in relation to other large like sectors that are as large, if not even larger than healthcare, is because we're, you're dealing kind of day to day, actually, with a human kind of in a very intimate setting. So it's, and then that can turn into, litigious
Yes.
situations. So I think a lot of kind of what you were saying, it brings like no doctor wants to be sued, really, at
That's
the end
right.
of the day.
That's right. Well, and you can say there are good and bad reasons why things go so slowly in healthcare. The good ones are the ones that you allude to. It is a highly regulated place. There's obviously a lot of money involved in the process. There are lawsuits that are potentially there, and it is a very human service. So I think there's good reason to be cautious, not take risks, undue risks anyway. On the other side, we can hide behind that though, and I think there are lots and lots of innovation that really don't touch the patient. For example, in the early days, where I think all technologies can make a difference. And I think AI in particular, and particularly in the non-clinical realm. I mean, there's admin galore. Apparently we spend in the US about a third of our 4.9 trillion it's projected to be this year on just sheer admin. That makes no sense. And there's not much risk in that. So I think we could penetrate much more with the technologies that are now available to us.
Yeah, it's funny here in the United States. It seems like the joke is like, what's the problem with the healthcare system? And it's like, you get the drug companies say one thing, the insurance companies, people say one thing, the doctors say one thing. And it's basically, you're looking at it from a very, as a stakeholder, you're only looking at it from your perspective, and you're
That's
not
right.
really looking at it from like a patient's perspective necessarily.
That's right. And I think what you can say, and it's a really good point again, I think, is that it's multi-stakeholder. So for me, healthcare is not an industry. I mean, you mentioned other industries. It's not the airlines. It's not the car industry. It's not hotels. It's a multifactorial industry. So pharma doesn't necessarily work in an integrated basis. It's somewhat separate too, as is biotech, as is the provider side of healthcare or the payer side of healthcare. So this is one of the problems we have to coordinate. And perhaps this is where there's opportunity in the technology space to improve that over time.
And, specifically when it comes to the healthcare space, one of the things that I've always found fascinating just about the industry, just overall, is I had this preconceived notion before I actually kind of did a kind of a deeper dive into it. Oh, healthcare, it's just primary care. You see your doctor once a year, bye, see you next year. But it's like this very complex sort of system that it's, that you only, yet again, from a patient perspective, for those who do see their primary care perspective or primary care physician, that might be the only healthcare that they interact with on a
Yeah.
free on a yearly basis. So it's just kind of interesting. Kind of the older I've gotten, the more I see like, oh well, there's specialists, there's primary care physicians, there's dentists. You don't realize really like how much healthcare really touches your day to day life.
Yeah, much more than you see. And you're right, the main interactions are actually the biggest interaction people have, of course, is with their pharmacist. They'll see their pharmacist between 8 and 10 times a year because they're picking up drugs, I mean, particularly people with conditions. Their primary care doc maybe once or twice a year, but most of the rest of healthcare is invisible to them. And yet there are many, many, many people behind the scenes, not the least of which are specialists and then, drug companies and PBMs and all these other players in the space. That's what creates the complexity, unfortunately.
Yeah, you bring up complexity. It's like one of the big things here in the United States is around like prior authorization and about
Yes.
how AI is being used for prior auth. And, kind of one of the things that it's like if you just even touch prior authorization or even like step therapy for that matter, someone is going to say, don't do it. Like it's one of those very like, I call those hot potato issues.
They certainly are hot potato issues. And, as you can hear from my accent, I've actually worked in the UK healthcare system originally. I worked in the Australian healthcare system. I've been in the States now for 20 years. I've never seen such a complex system, and it's taken a long time to wrap my head around the way things work. And in some ways, I've never seen a system that is so driven by politics at one level, the law by another, and the law is not just federal law, it's state law in many cases. Medicaid, for example, is administered at state level. And then below that, it's insurance. Which of course is managing the reimbursement, and then, as you say, the wars that are existing on prior authorization between provider and payer, and they are wars. They're now AI wars because AI is actually writing those prior auths, and another AI is accepting or rejecting them. So these are not even got humans in the mix. Lastly, it's people who are directly involved in healthcare, which is a little bit sad because it means the people who are actually rendering the care are fourth in line. They're behind politics and legal and insurance. And that doesn't help us generally because it's just, yet again, too much complexity.
Yeah. Or there's, I like to say, welcome to America.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's the way things work here sometimes. It's a
Yeah.
big country, let's be honest.
And you bring up an interesting point, and I've said it before, like an average, what is like the average European country, and Germany is an outlier, but Germany is like the largest. It's like 80 to 100 million people. I just I just think from an American perspective, and that's the thing, you'll hear people arguing of like, well, why can't we be like Europe? And I'm like, well, Europe is multiple countries. It's not just one continent. So it's like in each country does, even though yes, they are all, the majority of them are part of the EU,
Mhm.
they do have their own ways of doing things from country to country. And I just think what works, and I'm just taking Germany for as an example, what works in Germany that might have 80 to 100 million people and applying it here in the US that has close to 400 million, like logistically, it's just not possible.
That's
I
right.
would argue to work what works in one country that's smaller from a population standpoint and apply it here because you might have in European countries maybe one to two, maybe three, four large cities max compared to the US where we have
Yeah.
like LA, Boston, Chicago, San
Sure.
Francisco. So it's like
Sure.
we just have it's a bigger country and we just have larger cities and a
That's
lot
right.
more of them.
Yeah, and scale's definitely a big difference. There's no question about it, and we have to get our head around that, and we have to deal with that sort of scale issue every single day. I'll give you a couple of examples where I see differences that we should pay attention to, though,
Mm,
because it is common to pretty much every European country. I think one of them is that social care is integrated beautifully into healthcare. We don't
mhm.
separate it in Europe where we do separate it here. They're funded differently, they're under different regulatory rules, the laws apply differently. And I think that creates potential issues. So if you think about, social determinants of health, for example. It's the social care network that's actually supplying that on an integrated basis in Europe, which means they generally do a better job at case assessment because they're integrating who we are as individuals. You, Dylan, as an individual, me as an individual, is not just my healthcare record. It's not that I broke my leg skiing 4 years ago. It's actually who I am demographically and psychographically. So I think that's one big difference. The other is that mental health and physical health are much more integrated now, and they're not completely integrated, but here they're almost separate worlds. So the world of psychology and psychiatry, and that's my background, is a very separate beast in the US to physical health. And they don't necessarily talk to each other very, very well. In Europe, that's better. So behavioral health and mental health is actually much more coordinated. So I think those are lessons we could use over here, even though we've got the scale issue, as you say.
And you working in the UK and in Australia is and then coming to the United States, was kind of the separation between kind of primary health and kind of social care, was that kind of you would say the biggest difference that you saw with the American healthcare system versus kind of what you've experienced up until that point?
Yeah, they were certainly the biggest surprises out of the gate, no question about it. I think very quickly, though, I realized that reimbursement drives so much in terms of innovation. I mean, there is a private pay market here, but generally speaking, 90% of it is in the fee-for-service system. And despite our best efforts with value-based care, that's still true at the significant level. So I think very quickly, that was the third thing, that you have to navigate that system. You have to think about where those monies flow today and how it creates workflow. So if you're a technologist or you want to deploy AI, to go back to that, you really have to do that within that context. So that became dominant just in terms of at least how I think about advising small companies trying to become big companies in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's, kind of here, I don't know how familiar you are with the legislative process here in the United States. So it can take a good 10 to 15 years for a bill to get passed. And that's assuming the member who sponsors it, or the one who's bringing, who brings it to the floor, either on the House or the Senate side. They keep getting reelected. They don't die in office. I mean,
That's right.
and this is more of a joke, but it's also true. They don't go to jail for anything.
Of course, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
in some ways, Dylan, it's worse than that, because I think if you go and take the very big act that was, became the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, which was 2008, enacted in 2009, had lots of things at the center of it, value-based care being one of them. Here we are in 2024. And in fact, we've made, only so much progress. Arguments are different, but maybe 5 to 6% of the system is now value-based as opposed to fee-for-service. That's tiny progress in 20 years. And it's largely because we've had lots of different political parties in that time since 2009. We've seen power flex itself between the two sides. And it's been either funded or not. So I think funding becomes an issue. Is there money behind this legislation? So I think that's another piece of complexity that we have to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, I would even go as far as saying, John, Congress has already lost the battle when it comes to AI.
That may be true. And don't forget, I think Congress and the Senate are always running behind new technology. I mean, when the internet arrived, we were slow to regulate it. And in fact, when computers arrived after the Second World War, we were slow to regulate what they were going to do. People laughed at this whole idea of this would be, a computer on every desk in the land. So we're always slow to do that. So I'm not unhopeful that we'll be able to play catch up. But this particular technology is super powerful. I mean, because of supercomputers around now. So I think we need to see some pretty urgent action. Whoever wins the election in November, I think there's got to be a lot more effort invested in how do you create the framework for AI to help humanity and not hinder it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And because you bring up an interesting point, because a bill is supposed to solve one problem. Like, it's like, the typical research paper used to do. It's like, what is the research question you want to ask? What are your arguments? What are your key points? What's your conclusion? And, by the time, let's just say, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, by the time that bill gets passed to solve that one particular portion of, AI in healthcare, whatever it is, and let's just say it takes 10 years, just giving you the minimum of that range, you already, you pass it, but you already have like 19 other issues that are like right behind it. So,
That's right.
it's just not, I don't know. I don't want to say it's not sustainable, but it's like it's just not possible to it's not possible to predict the future though at the same time.
No, agreed. And you're right. I mean, it's a bit like painting a very large bridge, right? By the time you've started painting it at one end, it's peeling at the end you started with. When you get to the end, it's the same. So I get it. I think the technology you're trying to regulate is not the same in 10 years as it was when you started. That said, I think going back to Europe again, I think Europe has taken the whole AI change very seriously, very quickly, particularly as the European Union. So I think one of the things we can do is emulate the best of what we're seeing come out as a technology around things like ethics, privacy, cybersecurity more generally, and some of those things, and then managing some of the risks that we know about today, and will only get bigger because the AI will get more powerful in terms of what it's able to do. So, as I say, I'm a little bit more hopeful that we can wrap our head around this in the near future.
Yeah. Well, and then you also bring up another interesting point because yet again, like, I mean, I will say, so two things. So I don't think big tech is this evil entity that we're making it out to be, but at the same time, people need to have. I also don't think it's fair yet again to blame the big tech companies because they're just providing a service that people are using. It's not like, it's not compulsory. Like they're not making you give your login information to people. So I just think like it's just like where's the consumer? We just in this country, I will say, regardless if it's food or if it's technology, we just do a really bad job of educating the consumers of this is what's going to happen if you sign. I mean, we do have terms and conditions, don't get me wrong, but like no one reads those.
They
So
don't.
I mean it's what like kind of my question to you is then where does the company responsibility stop and but then where does the consumer responsibility begin?
Yeah, that is such a conundrum, and I agree with you. I don't think we should demonize big tech, and certainly not as a whole sector. I think they usually start out doing different things and serving their customer needs and doing it very well. I mean, I think AI development in some of the big platforms is incredible now. I think it comes back to regulation, Dylan, ultimately for me. I think the politicians have got to make sure they've created enabling technology that make sure that big tech are educating their customers about the risks, the downsides, what they're giving up. And I think one of the ways to do that, just to be specific, is I don't think you can put a 65-page document every time you do an upgrade to your iPhone or your Samsung or whatever it might be, because no one's going to read that stuff. It's got to come down to something that in the 7 seconds of attention people can pay, they get it, that there's 10 risks here and you are giving those risks up. Your data will be sold. Your data will go to, these places. So if that concerns you, do not say yes on it.
Hmm.
So I think we've got to find that happy medium between regulators and big tech, which I think we've lost in the last decade in particular.
No, definitely. And it's what is the I think the app like I was reading something that the average like attention span is basically like a I call them an Instagram reel, but it's like maybe 15 to 30 seconds max. And it's
Yep.
like if you can't get someone's attention within those 15 to 30 seconds, then you're already long gone.
Yeah, long gone. And I would argue it's actually come down on that. As I said, I'm a psychologist by background, and I've been reading about this. I think the attention span, if you go back 50 years, was always small. It was about a minute. I think we long since sailed past the 30 seconds. I think we're honestly down to under 10 seconds now. I think if people haven't got a message in that 10 seconds, I think you're toast.
Yeah.
So I think it does force us, and it's had massive impacts on things like education. You mentioned education, the consumer education generally, and whether it's in the classroom or the university, has to be in sound bites now, which means we've got to change all the ways that we design curriculum, design information. Now, is that a good trend? Maybe not, but it's reality. So I think we just have to deal with it now. But particularly in younger generations, I know people now under the age of 21 have got even shorter attention spans, and that just blows my mind. What can you say in 5 seconds?
Yeah, no doubt. And it's a generational thing
It
too as
is.
well because it's
Yeah.
like for example I see older generations reading newspapers and then I'm
Yes.
like I can walk and read Reuters on my cell phone at the same time.
Yeah,
So
that's right. So you're multitasking, and you know, there's good and bad about that, right? I mean, to some extent, we've now got, and most of the things I used to read physically are now, you know, they're in a Kindle or they're on my iPhone or they're on a podcast. He says, ironically, when we're talking like this
yeah.
medium can go anywhere, right? Both visually and from an auditory perspective. But I think it's got, you know, a lot of mental agility and even mental health challenges as well. Jonathan Haidt wrote a very good book called The Anxious Generation, which is really about Gen Z and the sort of generation that's grown up with nothing but their smartphones, saying that actually there's lots of stuff they can't pay attention to because it just is overwhelming, and the brain is not developing in perhaps the way it used to. It's fascinating stuff, and we're not at the end of it yet.
No, definitely. And so we've talked about kind of how you got into AI healthcare. We've talked about some organizations that you're involved in. Kind of, we've talked about kind of how you want to contribute to the space and the organizations. We talked about the political side too as well. And the last question I did have for you in particular is specifically where do you it's about the future. Where do you see this industry going?
Wow, that's a huge question. So I think I mean, healthcare is here to stay. It's something that's going to matter more and more in this complex world. It's particularly going to matter because we know we're generally living longer. I know we've had problems through the pandemic period, but generally speaking, we know the arc is to live longer. We're going to have to live longer with chronic conditions, but we now have available to us tools that can help us to thrive. To boost our health span and those things. So what I hope, and you know, I've got no crystal ball, but what I hope is that we start to change the emphasis from some of the things we perhaps solve for now, sick care. You know, we've conquered diseases, we have antibiotics, we've dealt with, you know, germ problems by and large, even though there are some third world problems. I think we need to get onto the wellness side of the fence. So I'm hopeful that that's where technology in particular can help us to do things very early in life and then through our life to go and give us the capacity to go and live as fully as we possibly can without disease, without mental health problems, where it may be. And I think technology can be an innovation, generally a driver of all of that. And that excites me. It's a very worthy industry to be part of. I love being in healthcare because we're talking about people's lives and being available to do what you and I are doing today, conversing, coming up with new ideas and making, you know, humanity better. What's better than that? So I'm hopeful for the future, and it's why I like the space that I'm in.
Yeah, and I love it too because you're like, oh, I have this great idea, but then, it also brings you back to reality relatively quickly too as
It
well.
sure does. It sure
Yeah,
does.
you can't be arrogant in this space.
You can't. In fact, humility, I would argue, is the key thing. I think we've got to be humble. We are not necessarily the smartest people in the room. And the more we're conversing like this and in all the circles, it's why I like going to conferences, for example. I'm going to another one next week in Las Vegas. I just love those conversations because I think that's with humility, it's a way to go and start to see a new opportunity.
No, definitely. And John, where can people find out more about you or the organizations that you're a part of?
Yeah, probably the best place. I mean, we're all on many platforms these days. I think LinkedIn is probably the one that's easiest for people. I'm Jon C. Warner, and there's no H in my name. It's Jon on LinkedIn. So that's the best place. People can connect with me. They can contact me there. I tend to post a lot, so my interests and the challenges that I see are all writ large in that environment. So that's probably the best place to make contact.
Awesome. And be sure to subscribe to the AI Healthcare Podcast YouTube channel and also listen to the audio version of this interview on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. John, thank you so much for your time today.
That's great, Dylan. Thanks.
Of course, this is